Welcome to Women's Perspectives, the podcast that celebrates powerful women who help change the world and strive to shape our future. Throughout art history, women have been represented as muses, lovers, wives, mothers, and daughters. But today, women are shaping culture like never before. Curators, architects, songwriters, journalists. Women in culture are leading the charge when it comes to challenging the status quo and celebrating female narratives. I'm Yara Shahidi, and I'm so excited to be joined today by Farah Nayeri. You are, I don't have to tell you, but so everybody knows, you are an incredible journalist, author, podcast host, which I love your podcast, by the way.
Thank you so much,
Culture Blast for everyone that needs to listen. And you currently just published a nonfiction book called The Takedown: Art and Power in the Digital Age. I'm really excited to be with you today because I think there's just so much to be discussed in regards to your work on the role of art history and the role of women in art history and how art can challenge and shape culture.
Women have virtually been erased, to be completely honest with you, for most of art history. And that's obviously for reasons which you appreciate, which is that women had very, very specific roles that they were supposed to fill. And that was the role of mother, you just mentioned, the role of daughter, the role of, it was sort of, you had to marry and give birth, and that was basically what your role was. And so that didn't leave any space for women to be artists. I mean, first of all, up until the 19th century, they weren't even allowed to become educated as artists. Right. And so it's only since the 19th century in Paris and then beyond, in the 20th and 21st that we've had women. And yet, even so, only more or less since the Me Too movement, really, have we had the prominent representation of women in the art and museum world. So it's kind of like we have been shockingly invisible.
Right. And I would love to get into that more, but starting with really your own coming to the art space and art history space. I know we're briefly mentioning our family's own migration stories, and you moved to Paris post-revolution, and I've heard you discuss before really how living in Paris informed your understanding of art.
Yes. I mean, when you live in Paris, as you know, Yara, you're kind of enveloped and sort of surrounded in architecture and art. In Paris, there was also this pressure to go to see museum exhibitions and exhibitions. Whenever there was a new exhibition, it was a bit like a new movie. Right. You kind of had to go see it. And so I became absolutely enthralled by art from my late teens, I would say. And Paris, it sort of bathes you in art. And even someone like me who can't draw or paint or anything in that kind of vein, you sort of become completely, absorbed by it.
Right. And I know for me, growing up in the TV and media landscape, my parents were really intentional about raising me with images of our cultures. And so it had taken me, really until my later teens to realize our general invisibility in the space of media, because I had grown up being surrounded by stories and people that looked like me. And so I'm curious about really your own reckoning and when you discovered the invisibility of women generally in this art space.
Okay, so invisibility of women in journalism. My generation, there were already a lot of women in journalism.
Right.
So I didn't feel invisible. But the invisibility of women in art, that is something that actually, it's funny, I was conscious of and yet not conscious of enough. That as women, we are sometimes complicit in the erasure of other women or in the invisibility of other women. We kind of went through all these years going to exhibitions that were by men, great men, extraordinary men, but who happened to be European, white. But we would, as journalists, cover whatever was on, and whatever was on was male. And yet we, as women, didn't kind of interrogate that enough and say, where are the women artists? It's something that we should have done.
And so when was the moment as a journalist when you decided to really shift your focus and dedicate so much of your time and reporting to centering women?
So I was going to these museums and I was writing about or, covering or interviewing these great artists, and they happened to be mostly male. But in 2017, I think, in the last, let's say, decade already, we've seen quite a lot of change. But I think the tipping point, the real serious tipping point, was the Harvey Weinstein scandal. And so it just was this kind of thing that that made the representation of women in all areas, all fields, absolutely urgent. It was no longer possible to sort of ignore that. And throughout the art forms, any discipline, filmmaking, women filmmakers, I covered the Cannes Film Festival for many years. Mm-hmm. There were years at Cannes where there were zero women in the lineup for the Palme d'Or, in the lineup for the top award. Same thing in art. Suddenly we were seeing solo exhibitions of women when we hadn't seen that before. Mm-hmm. And the death of George Floyd had exactly that same effect when it came to artists who were not of white origin. Artists who were non-white, suddenly you saw people, and it was really very sudden, to be honest, showing, hiring, and representing artists who were African-American, who were Black British, you name it, just sort of people who were no longer of white European origin. You saw, so my whole, the argument that I make in my book and what I've observed is that social movements, aided by social media, they make a difference to the world of culture. They have made a huge difference in a way that nothing ever has before.
Mm-hmm. And I think as somebody that has heard many times this kind of argument that what was missing was the talent, and that's why you aren't seeing women, that's why you aren't seeing people other than dominant culture, white men, centered. I think oftentimes people don't necessarily understand the level of challenge that's being faced when cultural creators and creative people are trying to be in the spotlight or trying to share their narratives. And so prior to these two movements, in your expertise, what were those obstacles? Why was there this generational lacking of women when, we can do the retrospectives and see that we've always been talented. There have always been creatives. There have always been painters. There have always been art makers that come from our communities, but they happen to, like you're saying, never make it into the exhibits, never make it into the hands of the curator.
Yes, exactly. And, because to put it simply, Yara, women were not considered good enough. We were not good enough. Mm-hmm. So there were plenty of women artists around, but they were out in their little corner doing what they did. And there were some extraordinary talents doing what they did pretty much out of the spotlight or intermittently in the spotlight. There was an American art historian called Linda Nochlin, and she was attending graduation at Vassar College in 1971. And a very famous American gallerist came up to her and said, "Linda, I'd like to show some women artists, but why are they so few, women artists, talented women that I can show?" And so she was so shocked and staggered by it. That became the title of an essay she wrote in 1971 called "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" And this is a very famous moment in art history. And what she explained, and which we were saying earlier, is that women were always, basically forced into these child-giving, childbearing, marriage, husband-keeping kind of roles. And they were not they were not given the opportunities. And so it's not women's fault, but it was the fault of education and institutions. And in recent years, we have now suddenly, again, it's a very sudden thing, gone out and found these women artists who had been working so hard and so well for so long, and suddenly realized, my God, they are tremendously good. Like the sculptor Louise Bourgeois of France, who was New York based for much of her life. She's a huge name now in the art market, but she became a huge name late in life. In 2019, there was an artist called Luchita Hurtado. She was 98 when she was shown in London at the Serpentine Galleries. It was her first museum exhibition.
Wow.
She passed away the following year. So, it's kind of, why do we women have to wait so long? I mean, you and I don't, because we're in a different world, and now it's post-Me Too, and we're getting opportunities. But so many, many, many generations of women before us were completely overlooked.
Right. And it really feeds into a thesis you have regarding the connection between art and power. And as we're hearing, just the role of infrastructure, the role of, let's say, the museum as a gatekeeper, but the role of all of these institutions as gatekeepers of opportunities, I'm curious to just really know more, personally, just because that was so much of what my thesis was on as a college student. But what has the role of art and power been in both maintaining power and, in this new phase in which art has been used to disrupt ongoing or continuous power structures?
Yeah. I mean, writing the book, the first 3 words of my book are art is power. And basically what I realized looking back, even in art history, is that people in power, whoever they may be, were always looking to control artists and art. So back in the day, these people used to be popes and princes, and they were men, of course, popes and princes and kings and nobility. And these were the people with the power in the Western world. And they were controlling artists. They were commissioning artists. Michelangelo did the Sistine Chapel because he was commissioned by a pope, and on and on. And every now and again, you would have backlashes, right? Led by, there's a crazy monk in Florence called Savonarola who created this bonfire of the vanities in Florence where he had paintings and works of art and everything burned. So art was viewed as something dangerous to the people in power, and people in power controlled it. Today, the people in power are us. You and I, we have the power. So it is social media campaigns, ordinary people, citizens, who, using the power of the internet, are contesting art.
And how do we continue to aid in that process? We're seeing, like you're saying, this beautifully democratic push to say us as people, us as everyday citizens should be able to participate in creating and seeing and celebrating art. But for those of us that don't know where to start, for those of us that are new to the art world, I know for me it took my professor, Sarah Lewis, really introducing me to art so I could understand how infrastructures work, understand how I could participate. But it was just so opaque to me before that. It felt like this whole other world that had nothing to do with me, and if I was lucky enough to see something in a museum, then great. But where does somebody start? If you know that art is your passion, how do you begin to insert yourself in that process? How do you begin to disrupt these systems?
You're absolutely right, Yara. I mean, you were a Harvard student and you were feeling excluded from the art world. Imagine what somebody who's not gone to Harvard feels, someone, who is intrigued, who would like to understand more. It's true that art is a tricky thing to get your head around. It's a discipline that, like classical music, you kind of need a few keys and codes, just a little bit, to step in. On the other hand, you don't need anything to really appreciate a painting. Art is emotion, and the best art is emotional. And I think that the greatest service one can do to humankind is education, is schooling, is from the time a child opens their eyes, for them to be taken to museums, for them to be taken and parked in front of a painting that looks beautiful to everybody. And so I think the key is exposure. I think we all need to see so much art, and we need to be exposed just as we are exposed to your movies. We need more access to art museums.
And you've, in this really necessary way, paired the skill of journalism and your deep interest and knowledge of art to aid in that exposure, to allow us as a public to ask certain conversations about what artists were heralding, how we're looking at these infrastructures. And I'm really curious when, really in your career, you figured out how to activate your profession in this way, because I think something that has always interested me is the fact that we're all kind of given certain gifts and skills. And I think especially now in this age of social media, there can feel a pressure to be able to be of service, but in a certain type of way. And I think what I always find endlessly impressive is when somebody finds exactly how they know they can be of service, exactly how they know they can contribute most powerfully, and are able to make change there. And so what was that realization for you that journalism was your way in?
Well, I decided when I was about 10 or 11, I wanted to be a journalist.
That's a very early
It
choice.
is, yeah, it is. I think because my dad was a diplomat and I worshipped him, and I kind of was watching him go around and meet cabinet ministers and statesmen or whatever it was. And I was looking at him and admiring him, thinking, God, how can I get into those rooms and into those conversations? And so I decided I want to be a journalist, but I'm also artistic in some way, if I may say.
Well, you have musical abilities. Please share. Please share.
I mean, it's a bit pretentious, but yes. I mean, I started piano when I was 5.5 years old, and I almost became a pianist as a career. So music is very much, it's a visceral part of me. That is the discipline or art form that I can do, as opposed to drawing and painting, which I can't do. But then, being musical and also being a writer. I mean, writing is also an important, very important art form or discipline for me. I was very in tune with art, I guess, with artists, and I understood the language of artists. And so, for the longest time, I covered politics and international relations, but at a certain point, I switched to culture because I loved writing about it, and I just never left. Yeah,
I love that. I think part of when we're talking about this kind of timeline that you've helped us create in regards to the way culture has developed, why it feels like there are communities, women, people of color that are serially underrepresented, and then boom, we're seeing this really beautiful blooming. Curious to know, I feel like so many of us have seen or at least have experienced the feeling that people think that diversity and inclusion are in some ways optional. And I'm wondering, just in your opinion, now that we're living in this time in which we do have access to new artists, to voices that have always been there, but are centered in this new way, why is diversity and inclusion important? Why is it important to maintain this moment that we're in versus let it pass like a phase?
Well, first of all, it's incredibly important because for most of human history, we've obliterated and erased the communities and the categories you just described. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you were a woman and an artist of any description, you were ignored, mostly ignored. There were exceptions, but not many.
Right.
And if you were an artist and you were male, but you were not white, or even female and not white, and you were ignored as well. So I think we've reached a point where this has all become part of the regular, normal way of doing business. Mm-hmm. In other words, we are not going to go back to the way things used to be. I don't think so. Mm-hmm. In the epilogue to my book, I interview a few smart people, and one of them is Anne Temkin of MoMA, and she says the genie is out of the bottle. Mm-hmm. And I really, really do firmly believe that. We're not going to go back to a time when women are not going to be visible anymore, when artists who are not male or European are not going to be visible. I just don't see that happening. We have gone too far now in the whole diversity push, and we've actually been exposed to so many great women artists and great creators and artists who are not white European.
I think I've taken on the title or idea or concept of being color aware, and this idea of appreciating what our cultures have to offer us that are perhaps differing in, my Black and Iranian heritage. The fact that I show up in the world as a very specific human being as a result of centuries of a certain type of lineage, and getting to a point in art and culture in which we can appreciate our particular lenses and perspectives. But as you're saying, we're no longer checking the boxes of saying, you were brought into this space as a result of this heritage, or I think detrimentally, so many times there's this feeling that the only people that can appreciate the works of artists of color, of women artists, are people of those same backgrounds, versus thinking of all those artists that you've cited, the Hank Willis Thomases, the Theaster Gates, as having something to offer to all of us, having something to say about humanity for all of us, that is both rooted in their specific origins, but also really, there's no barriers or limits to who can enjoy, who can learn, who can grow from experiencing what they have to offer.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And then going to really the conversation or question of maintenance, of maintaining this moment that we're in, of making sure that there is no slide back. And I'm wondering, first starting specifically in the art world, but then really zooming out, what are the roles of curators? What are the roles of these people that have been placed in these infrastructures in making sure that they are centering a non-white majority? They're making sure they're centering people of different identities and backgrounds.
I think it's extremely important what you're saying, Yara, in the sense that curators, museum directors, and museum boards, they have to absolutely be conscious of and even reflective of society. I mean, we can't have curators who are, of a generation that completely ignored, let's say women artists, or was blind to African American artists or artists who were not of white European background. And I think it's very, very important to have younger generations be brought in. Museums have to be brought in, have to be run by younger generations of people and people who are much more representative of society. Now we've reached a stage where we have to kind of include everyone and make sure, as you say, that this thinking is entrenched from the very top all the way through.
And you've talked about this before, but I wanted to really expand on so much of your work centering on the role of social media and the role of this very new digital age we're in as being really responsible for and helpful in the democratization of these art spaces and of bringing in new voices. And so I'm wondering generally how you felt the digital age has created a different way of producing and consuming art.
Yeah, I mean, as I was saying before, like power used to be held by people at the top, right? Now in our democratic age, it's from the bottom up that people, as I was saying, that people decide what we should be, what kind of art is acceptable, what kind of museum behavior or cultural behavior is acceptable. And so from this bottom up sort of hashtag driven movement means that it's power to the people. And I think that it's mostly a favorable and a positive development. I think social media is absolutely key right now to social progress. And I don't think that social media is going to be something that's going to be used to cancel people and that, whole slew of generations of artists and actors or whatever are going to get canceled. I just think that the whole movement is going to become much more natural and organic part of the way things should take place.
Absolutely. Now, I think really to leave people with people to follow, people that they should be paying attention to, I'm wondering, based on just your vast knowledge, who are the artists that you're tracking right now? Who do you feel like is a good representation of where we're going in the artistic and creative spaces? Or I guess who moves you to an exhibit? Whose name do you see and you're like, yep, I have to be there?
So I love so many artists. I mean, so many millions and billions of artists. I mean, it's a broad church, and I love Manet, Degas, Caravaggio, Giotto, all the way up to the artists of today. But I did have a very, very special experience last summer. Summer before last. Because Theaster Gates came to London and created a temporary pavilion for the Serpentine Galleries. And I have to say, Theaster is an artist who's very difficult to encapsulate in words, but he kind of covers the many, many different ranges of disciplines. He describes himself as a potter, and he produces extraordinarily beautiful pots. But he is also, part of his art is the regeneration of parts of Chicago. That's part of his art form. Speaking is part of his art form. Performing music is part of his art form. So here was this man, and he produced this gorgeous chapel, this sort of a chapel made of timber. And it was almost like being in a church. And so I suppose Theaster's name comes to mind because that was just such an extraordinary temporary work, temporary pavilion, but it also kind of captured everything that Theaster does, which I think in a way prefigures the art of tomorrow. Theaster Gates by being multidisciplinary, he is very much the reflection of the way artists are increasingly going to be. Increasingly, artists are not going to be one thing. You're not just going to be a painter or a sculptor. You're going to be painting, sculpting, doing installation, video, film, speech, performance, music, you name it. And I think that that is the direction that we're heading in.
Right. And I think so many of us from minority communities, his work kind of captures the role of our art as both inheritance and future building, of bringing people forward that haven't had the spotlight prior, and then also demonstrating where we can go and where we will be going. So what a beautiful name to bring up, because anybody who does not know his work should get deeply familiar with it. Well, I just have to say I'm so grateful for your time, for your insight. Yeah, excited for this conversation to be shared, because I think it's so important that we continue to engage with the art world as a vehicle for social change, as it has been.
Thank you, Yara.
Thank you.